All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Serbia's role in the Yugoslav wars,
Right.
like 1991 to 2001, that whole decade. And, you sent over a whole bunch of stuff, and it's a lot.
Yeah.
So I guess what we're trying to do today is, distill it down to, the key stuff.
Exactly.
For people who maybe don't have, all the time in the world, go through every single article and book.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to say right off the bat that when we talk about the Yugoslav wars, sometimes people say, oh, the Serbian Civil War. But Serbia itself, it didn't really have a civil war in the traditional sense. It was part of these broader Yugoslav wars.
Right. So not like a civil war just within Serbia's borders, but Serbia was definitely right in the thick of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Deeply involved in all these conflicts that, spread across the whole region. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, even Macedonia.
Yeah, a lot of different places, a lot of different groups involved.
Yeah, so to make sure we're both on the same page, I thought we could lay out a bit of a roadmap for today.
Sure.
So we'll start with some historical background, right? How Yugoslavia even came to be in the first place.
Okay.
Then we'll dig into what were the root causes of these wars, why did things explode the way they did? Then we'll break down the main phases of each conflict, what happened, where and when.
Right.
Then we'll talk about the major players, the big names on all sides.
There.
And then the really tough part, the consequences, war crimes, the human cost of it all.
See.
And then finally, we'll try to wrap our heads around, the current situation and what this all means, the legacy of these wars.
Absolutely. Sounds like a good plan.
Okay, cool. So let's rewind a bit. How did Yugoslavia even, come into existence?
So after World War I, in 1918, you had this coming together of different groups in the Balkans. And Serbia played a really significant role in the creation of this new country called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes.
Oh, wow. So that's where the name Yugoslavia comes from.
Exactly. And even from the beginning, there were tensions. You had Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Albanians, Macedonians, all these groups with their own distinct histories and cultures.
So right from the start, it was this kind of a forced marriage.
Well, there was definitely this idea of unity, this pan-Slavic ideal. But at the same time, there were underlying differences and some resentment towards Serbian dominance.
Yeah, I can imagine. So then fast forward a few decades, World War II happens. What happens after that?
So after World War II, you have the rise of communism in Yugoslavia. And this is where Josip Broz Tito comes in. He becomes the leader of this new socialist Yugoslavia.
And Tito was a huge figure, right?
A huge figure, absolutely. He was incredibly charismatic, a strong leader, and he was really good at, keeping a lid on all those simmering ethnic tensions.
Right, he was the glue that held Yugoslavia together, for a while at least.
Exactly. And it's important to remember the structure of Yugoslavia at this time. You had 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. And then within Serbia itself, there were 2 autonomous regions: Kosovo and Vojvodina.
Okay, so it's like a country made up of countries.
Exactly. Very complex.
Yeah, but it sounds like Tito was able to manage this complexity, at least for a while.
For a time, yeah. He kept a tight grip on things. But, no one lives forever. And when Tito died in 1980, well, things started to unravel pretty quickly.
So Tito's death is this turning point, right?
Definitely a pivotal moment. The loss of his leadership created a power vacuum. And that vacuum was filled by a surge of nationalism, and a lot of it was fueled by economic hardship.
Right, because the 80s were a tough time economically for Yugoslavia, right?
Yeah, things weren't going well. And people started looking for someone to blame, It's easy to scapegoat other ethnic groups when times are hard.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where Slobodan Milosevic enters the scene, right?
Exactly. He rises to power in Serbia in 1987, and he really taps into this growing sense of Serbian nationalism.
And his whole thing was creating a greater Serbia, right?
Yeah, his vision was basically to unite all Serbs, no matter where they lived, into one big Serbian state.
Which, sounds kind of reasonable on the surface.
Sure, but the problem was, a lot of those Serbs lived in other republics. And those republics were like, no, we're not interested in being part of Serbia. They wanted their own independence.
Right, so you have Milosevic pushing for this greater Serbia, and then you have these other republics who are like, nope, we're out.
Yeah, and that's where things get really messy. And it's not just about nationalism either. You had this backdrop of economic hardship. People struggling to get by. And the media, especially in Serbia, started pumping out all this propaganda, this fear-mongering, talking about how Serbs were being persecuted in other republics.
Oh, wow. So it's like this perfect storm of like bad economics, rising nationalism, and then like you throw in some media manipulation.
It was a recipe for disaster.
And then, of course, you have the Yugoslav army, the JNA. They weren't exactly impartial in all of this, were they?
No, the JNA was heavily dominated by Serbs. And as things escalated, they started siding with the Serbs, providing them with weapons and support.
So it's like all these pieces are falling into place, and it's pretty clear that things are heading towards like a full-blown conflict.
Yeah, it's that classic kind of a slow-motion train wreck where like everyone can see it coming, but no one can stop it.
Right. So let's like break down these wars, one by one. The first one was in Slovenia, right? The 10-day war.
Right. In June 1991, Slovenia declares independence. And the JNA, they try to stop it. They send in troops, but it's over pretty quickly.
Why was that one so short?
Well, Slovenia had a very small Serb population, so it wasn't as strategically important to Serbia as some of the other republics.
Okay, so they're like, all right, fine, you can go. But then things really heat up in Croatia later that year.
Yeah, Croatia declares independence in 1991 as well. And this time the fighting is much more intense, much more brutal.
And like, why was Croatia different?
Croatia had a much larger Serb population, especially in the Krajina region. And these Serbs, they didn't want to be part of an independent Croatia. They wanted to stay with Serbia. So they rebelled with the backing of the JNA.
So it's like a war within a war.
Yeah, very complex, very messy. And this war drags on for 4 years. You have towns and cities being destroyed, atrocities on both sides.
And it ends with like a massive ethnic cleansing, right?
Yeah, in 1995, Croatia launches Operation Storm, and they retake the Krajina region.
Yep.
And in the process, hundreds of thousands of Serbs are forced to flee their homes.
So like just imagine the trauma, the displacement, the heartbreak. And then in 1992, the Bosnian War starts, which was like the most brutal of them all.
The Bosnian War was truly horrific. You have 3 sides fighting: Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims. And they're all vying for control of territory, all committing atrocities.
It sounds like total chaos.
It was. You have the siege of Sarajevo, which lasted for years. You have concentration camps, mass killings, rapes. It was just unimaginable brutality.
And Srebrenica, right? That was part of the Bosnian War.
Srebrenica was a UN safe area, supposedly protected by Dutch peacekeepers. But in July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces under Ratko Mladic overran the town and massacred over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys.
It's like one of the worst genocides in Europe since World War II.
It was a horrific crime, and it really highlights the failures of the international community to prevent these atrocities.
Right, like where was the world when all this was happening?
It's a question that still haunts us today. The Bosnian War finally ended with the Dayton Agreement in 1995. But it left Bosnia deeply divided, a country still struggling to heal.
Okay, so we have Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and then there's Kosovo.
The Kosovo War was a bit different. Kosovo was a province of Serbia with a majority Albanian population, and in the late 1990s, they start demanding independence.
But Serbia didn't want to let Kosovo go, right?
No, they saw Kosovo as part of their historical heartland. And Milosevic, he cracks down hard on the Kosovo Albanians, using the Serbian police and military to suppress any dissent.
And that's when NATO gets involved, right?
In 1999, after years of escalating violence and human rights abuses, NATO launches a bombing campaign against Serbia.
Was that like a controversial decision?
It was and still is. Some people saw it as a necessary intervention to stop the violence. Others saw it as an act of aggression against a sovereign nation.
But it did eventually lead to Serbia withdrawing from Kosovo, right?
Yes. And Kosovo eventually declared independence in 2008. But Serbia still refuses to recognize that independence.
So that's another unresolved issue, another source of tension in the region. And then there was like a smaller conflict in Macedonia in 2001, right?
Yeah, a brief insurgency involving ethnic Albanian rebels. But it was resolved relatively peacefully.
Okay, so we've like outlined the main phases of these wars. But what about the people, like the individuals who played key roles in all of this? We've mentioned Milosevic, but who else was there?
Well, on the Serbian side, you have Ratko Mladic, the Bosnian Serb military commander who was responsible for the Srebrenica massacre. He was finally captured in 2011 and convicted of genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
So, like, he was on the run for years.
Yeah, hiding out, trying to evade justice. And then you have Radovan Karadzic, the political leader of the Bosnian Serbs. He was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity in 2016.
So both of them, like, held accountable for their crimes.
In the end, yes. But it took a long time.
Right. And what about the other side, like the Croatian and Bosnian leaders?
In Croatia, you have Franjo Tuđman, the first president of independent Croatia. He was a controversial figure, accused of authoritarian tendencies, and of playing a role in some of the atrocities committed during the Croatian War.
So, like, not exactly a saint.
No, but he was also a key figure in Croatia's fight for independence. And in Bosnia, you have Alija Izetbegović, the first president of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He fought to maintain a multi-ethnic Bosnia, but faced incredible challenges, a war on multiple fronts.
So these were like complex individuals operating in incredibly difficult circumstances.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that. There were no easy answers, no clear-cut good guys and bad guys in these conflicts.
Yeah, it sounds like everyone had blood on their hands in some way.
To some extent, yes.
Okay, so like zooming out a bit, what were the big takeaways from these wars? What was the ultimate impact?
Well, the human cost was staggering. Over 140,000 people killed, millions displaced, you have entire communities destroyed, economies shattered, and a legacy of trauma and division that still lingers today.
And politically, like, the map of the Balkans was completely redrawn.
Exactly. Yugoslavia ceased to exist.
Yeah.
Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, Kosovo, they all became independent states.
And Serbia, like, lost a lot of territory and influence.
They did. And they're still struggling to come to terms with that loss, particularly the loss of Kosovo.
And what about, like, the international community? What role did they play in all of this?
Well, the international community was often criticized for not doing enough to stop the violence, especially in the early stages of the wars. The UN peacekeeping mission in Bosnia was largely ineffective.
And NATO's intervention in Kosovo was, like, a mixed bag?
It did stop the immediate violence, but it also created new problems and tensions.
So, like, there were no easy solutions, no clear victories.
No. The Yugoslav wars were a tragedy on so many levels.
Okay, so fast forward to today. Like, what's the current situation in the Balkans? How are these countries doing now?
Well, Slovenia and Croatia have joined the EU and are relatively stable. But Bosnia is still struggling with its ethnic divisions. Republika Srpska, the Serb-controlled entity within Bosnia, is constantly pushing for greater autonomy, and there are fears that it could eventually try to secede.
So, like, Bosnia is still a potential flashpoint.
It is. And then you have Kosovo, whose independence is still contested by Serbia. There are still tensions between the Albanian majority and the Serb minority in Kosovo.
And Serbia itself, like, what's their situation?
Serbia is in this awkward limbo. They want to join the EU, but they're still refusing to recognize Kosovo's independence. And they're still grappling with the legacy of the wars, the war crimes, the accusations of genocide.
So it sounds like the wounds of the past are still very raw.
They are. It takes a long time to heal from such deep divisions and such horrific violence.
And what about, like, the future? What are the prospects for lasting peace and stability in the Balkans?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? There's been a lot of progress since the wars ended, but the underlying tensions are still there. And it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of dialogue, a lot of willingness to compromise to truly overcome those divisions.
So, like, it's a work in progress.
It is. But I think there's hope. There's a younger generation growing up who didn't experience the wars firsthand, and they're more focused on the future, on building bridges rather than walls.
I hope you're right. So, to wrap things up, like, what's the one big takeaway you want people to remember about Serbia's role in the Yugoslav wars?
I think the main takeaway is that nationalism, when it's taken to an extreme, can be incredibly destructive. It can blind people to reason, to compassion, to the shared humanity that connects us all. And it can lead to unimaginable suffering, as we saw in the Balkans.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder, like, how do we prevent this from happening again, not just in the Balkans, but anywhere in the world?
That's the challenge, isn't it? We need to learn from the mistakes of the past. We need to promote tolerance, understanding, and respect for diversity. We need to build societies where everyone feels valued and respected, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, or background.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
It was my pleasure.